For 60 years, I've made sure that the third step on any staircase in my home is the loudest. My dear husband Dennis has replaced the stairs in our house twice in the 5 decades we've lived here, and both times I've stood over the carpenter's shoulder, a sweet old lady offering lemonade, making sure that when he got to that third tread from the bottom, he didn't fix it too well. I'd ask him to leave just a little play in the board, a fraction of an inch of space, so that it would announce the arrival of anyone who stepped on it with a long, mournful groan. The workmen always gave me a funny look, but Dennis would just chuckle and pat my arm, telling them, "Whatever makes my Betty happy." He's always thought it was just one of my little eccentricities, a charming quirk, like my insistence on sleeping on the side of the bed farthest from the door, or my strange aversion to the scent of Old Spice aftershave. He doesn't know that these aren't quirks, they are scars. He doesn't know that the sound of that specific creak isn't a charming feature of an old house, but the sound of my childhood ending. My name is Betty, and I am 73 years old. I've lived a good life, a long life, a life blessed with a love that I never thought I would be capable of accepting. But the foundations of this life were built over a chasm of silence, and I fear the ground is finally beginning to crumble. Please subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like on this video. The phone call came last Tuesday, a crisp autumn morning when the biggest worry on my mind was whether the squirrels had gotten to the last of the tomatoes in my garden. The voice on the other end was a young woman, polite and professional, from the County Department of Social Services. "Mrs. Miller?" she'd asked, and I confirmed it was me. "I'm calling about your mother, Joan." My blood ran cold. I hadn't heard that name spoken in connection to me in years. To most of the world, to my own children and grandchildren, my mother passed away decades ago. It was a lie I constructed piece by piece, a necessary fiction to protect the peaceful world I had so carefully built with Dennis. But the past, I'm learning, is never truly buried. It's just waiting for the right shovel to dig it up. The social worker explained that my mother, Joan, now 91 and living in a small, subsidized apartment 2 counties over, had suffered a fall. She wasn't seriously injured, but her mind was failing. She was confused, forgetful, and no longer capable of living on her own. The state couldn't find any other living relatives. "You're her only next of kin, Mrs. Miller," the young woman said, her voice full of a sympathy that felt like a hot poker against my skin. "She needs to be placed in full-time care, and as her daughter, the responsibility falls to you." Responsibility. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. For most of my life, my only responsibility concerning that woman was to stay as far away from her as possible. My responsibility was to the terrified 12-year-old girl I once was, the girl I swore I would protect for the rest of my life. And that meant keeping her mother out. Dennis found me in the kitchen an hour later, the phone still clutched in my hand, staring blankly at the wall. He gently pried it from my fingers and held me as I began to tremble. I told him the barest of facts. My estranged mother was alive, she was ill, and social services had called. I watched the conflict play out on his dear, honest face. He knew my mother and I had a difficult history. I had told him she was a selfish woman who had made poor choices, and we'd had a terrible falling out when I was a teenager. He accepted my explanation without question, as he always did, respecting the closed doors of my past. But Dennis is a man of unshakable decency. To him, an elderly mother in need was a sacred duty, regardless of past grievances. "Well," he said softly, his voice full of a compassion I couldn't muster, "we'll bring her here, of course. We can convert the downstairs study into a bedroom for her. It'll be an adjustment, but she's your mother, Betty. It's the right thing to do." He couldn't see the chasm opening up at my feet. He couldn't understand that bringing Joan into this house wasn't just an adjustment, it was an invasion. It was allowing the ghost I'd spent a lifetime exorcising to come and sit at my dinner table. Because what he doesn't know is that my mother wasn't just selfish. She was a collaborator. She was the silent partner in the crime that stole my girlhood. And the man she chose over me, my stepfather Larry, was a monster who wore the mask of a saint. The truth of what happened in that little house in the 60s was more terrible than Dennis could ever imagine, and Joan's crime wasn't what she did, but what she heard and chose to ignore. She heard the creak of that third stair, night after night, and she did nothing. What I discovered years later changed everything, but by then, the damage was etched into my soul. I know many of you listening today will understand this pain. We women of a certain age, we recognize the signs of a secret kept too long, the weight of a family history that is more sorrow than joy. It's a burden we carry in the quiet moments, isn't it? My biological father was a good man, a kind man with a laugh that could fill a whole house. He died of a sudden heart ailment when I was 10, leaving my mother, Joan, a young widow with a child to raise and no means to do it. The 2 years that followed were a blur of poverty and fear. My mother took on sewing work, her fingers often pricked and bleeding, her face a constant mask of worry. We moved from one cramped apartment to another, always one step ahead of the landlord. I saw her desperation, her profound loneliness. So when Larry came into our lives, I understood why she clung to him like a drowning woman to a life raft. He was a deacon at the local church, a widower himself, with a respectable job managing the town's hardware store. He wasn't a tall or imposing man, but he carried himself with an air of unshakable piety and confidence that people in our small southern town mistook for strength of character. He spoke in calm, measured tones, always had a Bible verse ready for any situation, and was generous with his time and money, especially when people were watching. He started courting my mother a year after my father died, bringing us a hot meal on Sundays, fixing the leaky faucet the landlord ignored, telling my mother she was a good woman who deserved a second chance at happiness. He seemed to be the answer to our prayers. When they married in the spring of 1964 and we moved into his tidy 2-story house on Elm Street, it felt like a fairy tale. For the first time in years, my mother smiled a genuine, relaxed smile. The worry lines on her forehead seemed to fade. We had a real home, with a garden in the back and a bedroom for me that didn't have peeling wallpaper. Larry, at first, was the perfect stepfather. He called me his little bonus, helped me with my homework, and praised my good grades in front of my mother, which made her beam with pride. The house was filled with the smell of my mother's baking again, a scent I had almost forgotten. We were, to all outside appearances, the perfect little family, saved by the grace of a good Christian man. But the devil is most dangerous when he's disguised as an angel. The signs started subtly, so small that a 12-year-old girl couldn't put a name to them, but could feel them like a change in the air pressure before a storm. It was the way his eyes would linger on me when my mother's back was turned. It was the way his hand, when he was helping me with a math problem, would rest on my shoulder, and his thumb would make slow, small circles that made my skin crawl. He would find reasons to come into my room when I was changing for bed, always with a plausible excuse, to fix a squeaky hinge, to bring me a glass of water I hadn't asked for. I tried to tell my mother once, early on. We were in the kitchen, washing dishes together. "Mama," I started, my voice barely a whisper. "Larry, he looks at me funny sometimes." She didn't stop scrubbing the pot in her hands. Her whole body went rigid. "What kind of nonsense is that, Betty? He's a good man. He's been a blessing to us." "But he—" I struggled for the words. "He comes into my room a lot, when I'm alone." She finally turned to look at me, but her eyes were cold, annoyed. It was the look of someone who didn't want to hear, who had already decided that my feelings were an inconvenience. "He's the man of this house now," she said sharply. "He can go into any room he pleases. Don't you go starting trouble with your wild imagination. We finally have a good life here. Don't you dare do anything to ruin it." Ruin it. That's what she thought I was doing. Not asking for help, not expressing a fear, but actively trying to destroy the fragile peace she had found. That conversation was the first lock clicking into place. I understood then that I was alone. My mother had made her choice. She had chosen the security Larry offered over the security of her own daughter. It was easier for her to believe I was a difficult, imaginative child than to confront the terrifying possibility that she had brought a predator into our home. The real nightmare began a few months later. It was a cold November evening, and a storm was raging outside. My mother was at a church meeting, a ladies' auxiliary group that Larry had encouraged her to join. He was home with me. I was in my room, reading a book for school, when I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs. I listened, my heart starting to pound. I could always tell where he was in the house by the sounds of the floorboards. But there was one sound that meant danger, the third step from the bottom. It had a deep, groaning creak that no other step possessed. When I heard that sound late at night, a knot of ice would form in my stomach. That night, I heard the creak. Then his steps continued up. They stopped outside my door. A soft knock. "Betty girl?" he called, his voice thick and smooth like honey. "Can I come in? I need to talk to you about something important." He didn't wait for an answer. The door opened, and he filled the frame, a silhouette against the dim hallway light. He closed the door behind him, and the soft click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. He sat on the edge of my bed. I was in my nightgown, and I instinctively pulled the covers up to my chin. "You're growing up so fast," he said, and his gaze traveled over the mound of blankets that covered me, as if he could see right through them. It was a look that made me feel like I was a bug under a magnifying glass. "You'll be a young woman before we know it. And there are things a young woman needs to understand. Things between a man and a woman." I could barely breathe. I knew, with a certainty that defied my young age, that this was profoundly wrong. "My mother she's talked to me about some things," I stammered, trying to scoot farther away from him. He let out a low chuckle, a sound that had nothing of humor in it. "Your mother," he said, his voice laced with a strange mix of pity and contempt. "Joan is a simple woman, Betty. A good woman, but simple. She can't teach you what you really need to know to please a man. But I can. I can teach you everything." His hand landed on my leg, over the thin cotton of my nightgown. It felt like a brand, a hot, heavy weight that paralyzed me with fear. I flinched so hard the bed springs squeaked. "I don't want to learn," I said, my voice trembling. "I want you to leave my room." He stood up slowly, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to get angry. Instead, he smiled, a cold, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "All right, little Betty, for now. But you need to understand something. I am the man of this house, and your mother and I, we are a team. We both want what's best for you." He walked to the door, and as he left, he looked back at me. "We'll continue this lesson another time." He closed the door, and I lay there, shaking, listening to his footsteps descend the stairs. I heard the television turn on in the living room, the sound of a cheerful sitcom filling the house, a grotesque counterpoint to the terror that was suffocating me. When my mother came home an hour later, I ran to her, tears streaming down my face. I told her everything, how he had come into my room, what he had said, how he had touched me. She listened, her face a blank canvas. When I was done, she sighed, a deep, weary sound. "Betty," she said, taking off her coat. "Larry works so hard for us. He puts a roof over our head and food on our table. The last thing he needs is you making up these fantasies. You probably had a bad dream." "It wasn't a dream, Mama. I was awake. He said you were a team. He said—" "Enough." Her voice was like a whip. "I will not hear another word of these lies. You are an ungrateful child. If I hear you speak ill of Larry again, I will send you away. Do you understand me? To a home for girls who don't appreciate what they have. A home for girls. It was the ultimate threat. To be sent away, to be truly and utterly alone. I understood perfectly. The second lock had just clicked into place, this one heavier, colder, more final than the first. I was not to speak. I was not to feel. I was to pretend. For the sake of the roof over our head, for the sake of my mother's fragile happiness, I was to become a ghost in my own life. And now, after more than half a century of silence, that woman is coming to live in my house. The woman who chose a monster over her child. The woman who heard the creaking stair and chose to roll over and go back to sleep. Dennis is upstairs now, whistling a happy tune as he clears out the study, making room for her. He's a good man, my Dennis. He has spent 55 years building a safe harbor for me, never knowing the full extent of the storm I came from. But now the storm is rolling in again, and I don't know if our walls are strong enough to withstand it. I don't know if I am. The day my mother was scheduled to arrive felt like a dream, one of those slow, suffocating nightmares where you're trying to run, but your feet are encased in concrete. The hours stretched and warped. I watched Dennis move through the house with a determined kindness that felt like a betrayal. He hummed as he adjusted the lighting in the downstairs study, making sure it was soft and wouldn't glare on the television he'd moved in for her. He checked the handrails he'd installed in the guest bathroom, testing them with his full weight. He was building a cage for me, a comfortable, well-lit, perfectly safe cage, and he was doing it out of love. That was the most exquisitely painful part of it all. He thought he was helping me, helping us, by doing his duty. He couldn't see that his every good deed was another nail in the coffin of the peace I had treasured for so long. I found myself performing strange, repetitive tasks. I scrubbed the kitchen grout with a toothbrush until my knuckles were raw. I rearranged the books on our shelves, not by author or title, but by the fading colors of their spines. Anything to keep my hands busy, to stop my mind from replaying the memories that were now scratching at the door, demanding to be let in. With every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, my stomach tightened. I was a condemned woman waiting for the executioner. Only the executioner was a frail, 89-year-old woman who probably wouldn't even remember the crime she had committed. I wonder if any of you have had to care for someone who hurt you deeply. It's a strange and bitter pill to swallow. Trying to be gentle with a hand that once held you down. Trying to offer comfort to a person who never offered it to you. It twists something inside of you. That conflict between the person you are now and the wounded child who still lives inside, screaming that this isn't fair. At 2 o'clock, a modest sedan I recognized as a county vehicle pulled into our driveway. My breath caught in my chest. Dennis, who had been watching from the living room window, put his arm around me. "Ready, honey?" he asked, his voice gentle. I shook my head, a small, involuntary motion. He squeezed my shoulder. "It'll be okay. We're in this together." But we weren't. He was standing on solid ground. I was standing at the edge of a cliff, and the ghost of my past was about to push me over. A young woman, the same one I'd spoken to on the phone, got out of the driver's side. She opened the back door, and the process of getting my mother out of the car began. It was a slow, agonizing affair. I watched from the doorway as my mother emerged, piece by piece. First, a thin orthopedic shoe, then a swollen ankle, then the hem of a worn wool coat that was too warm for the season. When she finally stood, hunched over a metal walker, she seemed smaller than I remembered, impossibly shrunken, as if life had whittled her down to almost nothing. Her hair was thin and white, and her face, when she looked up towards the house, was a road map of wrinkles and confusion. She didn't look like a monster. She looked like a lost old woman. And that somehow was worse. The clarity of my anger was suddenly muddied with a pity I didn't want to feel. Dennis went out to help, of course. He greeted the social worker with a polite nod and then turned to my mother, his voice warm and welcoming. "Joan," he said, taking her free arm gently. "It's Dennis, Betty's husband. We're so glad to have you with us." My mother blinked, her eyes watery and unfocused. "Dennis?" she murmured, the name sounding foreign on her tongue. "Oh, yes. The good one." She patted his arm, a flicker of the old charm appearing and disappearing in an instant. The social worker gave me a sympathetic, weary smile as they began the slow procession up the walkway. I remained rooted in the doorway, my body a block of ice. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. As they got closer, I could smell her, that familiar scent of lavender water and mothballs, a smell that transported me back to that little house on Elm Street so vividly that for a terrifying moment, I felt 12 years old again. She was the architect of my silence, the warden of my childhood prison, and now she was about to cross the threshold into my sanctuary. When she reached the front steps, her eyes finally found mine. She paused, her grip tightening on her walker. Her gaze held a flicker of something more than just senile confusion. It was recognition. And in that brief, lucid moment, her expression was not one of warmth or regret. It was one of guarded appraisal, the look of a chess player assessing her opponent. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a mask of pleasant, vacant fragility. "Betty," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "My little girl, look at you, all grown up." The words were a slap. My little girl. A title she had forfeited the right to use many years ago. Dennis, oblivious, beamed. "Come on in, Joan. Let's get you settled." He and the social worker guided her inside. As she passed me, her coat brushed against my arm, and I flinched as if I'd been burned. The next hour was a blur of logistics. The social worker handed me a folder of medical papers and a bag of prescription bottles, explaining dosages and schedules in a low, professional murmur. Dennis helped my mother out of her coat and guided her to the newly converted bedroom. I heard him showing her how to use the television remote, his patient voice explaining the buttons. I stood in the hall, clutching the plastic bag of pills, feeling like an intruder in my own home. After the social worker left, Dennis came back into the hall, rubbing his hands together. "Well," he said, his voice full of forced cheer. "That went well, don't you think? She seems a bit out of it, but she's sweet enough." He looked at me, his smile faltering slightly as he took in my rigid posture. "Honey, are you all right? You haven't said a word." "I'm tired," I lied. "Of course you are. It's a lot to take in." He hugged me, but my arms remained pinned to my sides. "It'll get easier, you'll see, once we fall into a routine." But a routine was the last thing I wanted. A routine implied permanence. It meant accepting that this was my new reality, living under the same roof as my jailer. The most disorienting part was the way she seemed to drift in and out of the present. One moment she would be asking me what year it was, and the next she would make a comment so sharp and specific it would take my breath away. Later that afternoon, as I was showing her where the guest bathroom was, she paused and ran her hand along the wallpaper in the hall. "Such a lovely pattern," she murmured. "You always did have good taste, even as a child. You kept your room so neat. Larry used to say you were a little perfectionist." The casual, almost fond way she said his name sent a jolt of ice through my veins. It was a masterful little move, a way of testing the waters, of bringing him into the room with us. She was reminding me of the narrative she had created all those years ago. Larry, the kind stepfather, Betty, the moody, difficult child. I didn't respond, just pointed towards the bathroom and walked away, my heart hammering against my ribs. Dinner was a masterpiece of tension. Dennis, bless his heart, tried to keep a cheerful conversation going. He asked my mother about the town she'd been living in, about the neighbors she'd had. She answered in vague, disjointed sentences, pushing her food around her plate. She seemed, for all intents and purposes, to be a harmless, confused old woman. I sat in silence, each bite of food tasting like ash. Then, halfway through the meal, she looked up at Dennis with a sudden bright clarity in her eyes. "You know," she said, her voice surprisingly strong, "Larry would have liked you. He truly would have. He was such a good judge of character. He always said a man's worth could be measured by how he treats the women in his family. He was so good to us. So patient." She turned her gaze to me. "He was especially patient with you, Betty. Always trying to draw you out of your shell." The fork slipped from my fingers and clattered onto my plate. The sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Dennis looked at me with concern. "Betty, are you feeling unwell?" I just need some air," I managed to say, pushing my chair back and escaping to the kitchen. I leaned against the counter, gasping for breath as if I had been underwater for too long. She was doing it. She was actively, deliberately rewriting history right in front of my husband, cementing her role as the grateful wife of a good man and me as the strange, ungrateful child. He would see this and believe it, because why wouldn't he? He was a good man who couldn't conceive of the kind of evil that had lived in that house on Elm Street. He saw a frail mother-in-law trying to connect. I saw a master manipulator laying the groundwork for her final performance. Later that evening, after I'd helped her get ready for bed, I was tidying up the living room. Dennis was upstairs running a bath. The house was quiet. I heard the door to her bedroom open, and then her slow, shuffling footsteps in the hall. I froze. She was coming towards the main staircase, and then I heard it. A long, mournful groan. The sound of the third step. My blood turned to ice water. Every muscle in my body seized. My breath hitched in my throat, and the room began to tilt. Suddenly, I wasn't in my safe, comfortable living room anymore. I was 12 years old, huddled under my covers, listening to that same sound, knowing it was the herald of a footstep outside my door. The smell of Old Spice seemed to fill the air, phantom and suffocating. My heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of my ribs, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't. "Betty!" Dennis's voice, sharp with alarm, cut through the fog of my panic. I hadn't realized he'd come back downstairs. I was leaning heavily against the mantelpiece, my knuckles white, sweat beading on my forehead. "What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't answer. I could only stare at the bottom of the staircase, where my mother now stood. She was leaning on her walker, looking not at me, but at the third step, a strange, thoughtful expression on her face. Then she lifted her head, and her eyes met mine across the room. The vacant, confused look was gone. In its place was a gaze as sharp and as cold as a shard of glass. She held my eyes for a long, silent moment, and a small, knowing smile played on her lips. It was a smile of shared secrets, a smile that said, I remember everything." Then she turned to Dennis, her expression instantly melting back into one of frail confusion. "Oh dear," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "These old stairs are so noisy. They frighten a person." She looked back at me, her eyes wide and innocent. "Some noises. You just never forget them, do you, Betty?" The three of us stood frozen in the dim light of the hallway, suspended in the echo of my mother's words. "Some noises. You just never forget them, do you, Betty?" The question was a declaration. A cold, smooth stone dropped into the placid pond of my life, and the ripples were spreading outwards, chilling everything they touched. Her face, still tilted up towards me, held that unnervingly lucid smile. It was the same smile I remembered from my childhood, the one that appeared whenever she had successfully navigated a difficult situation to her own advantage, a smile of quiet, unyielding victory. Dennis, bless his innocent heart, saw only a confused old woman making a strange comment. He rushed to her side, his face a mask of concern. "You're right, Joan," he said, his voice soothing, as if speaking to a child. "This old house is full of creaks and groans. Let's get you back to bed before you catch a chill." He placed a steadying hand on her arm, and the transformation was instantaneous. The sharp, knowing light in her eyes vanished, replaced by a watery, bewildered look. The victorious smile dissolved into a trembling lip. She was once again the frail, frightened victim. "Oh," she mumbled, leaning heavily on Dennis. "I get so turned around at night. I don't know where I am." "You're safe here," Dennis assured her, guiding her back towards her room. He glanced back at me, his brow furrowed with worry. "Betty, honey, why don't you go and sit down? You're as pale as a sheet. Did you have a dizzy spell?" A dizzy spell. It was a plausible explanation for my white-knuckled grip on the mantelpiece, for the sheen of cold sweat on my skin. I nodded, unable to form words. My throat felt as if it were full of crushed glass. I watched him lead her away, his broad, dependable back a shield for the woman who had used her own body as a shield for a monster. As he turned the corner into her room, she looked over her shoulder one last time. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and she gave me a slow, deliberate wink. The Cold War began the next morning. The days that followed were the longest of my life, a masterclass in psychological warfare conducted in the quiet, sunlit rooms of my own home. Joan was the perfect houseguest to Dennis. She was polite, undemanding, and touchingly grateful for his every small kindness. She would praise his coffee, compliment the roses he cut from the garden for her, and listen with rapt attention as he read the morning paper aloud to her. But when we were alone, even for a moment, the mask would slip. The attacks were never overt, never anything I could point to and tell Dennis, look what she's doing." They were subtle, insidious, and aimed with surgical precision at the most tender, wounded parts of my soul. She would hum. It was an old, cheerful tune from the 50s, a song I hadn't heard in decades, but I remembered it. Larry used to whistle it when he came home from the hardware store, the cheerful, carefree sound of his arrival, a harbinger of the dread that would settle over me for the rest of the evening. To hear that same tune now, hummed under my mother's breath as she folded her laundry at my kitchen table, was a form of exquisite torture. When she saw me freeze, my hand hovering over the sink, she would stop and look up at me. "Oh, goodness," she'd say with a little laugh. Just an old song popped into my head. Can't remember the name of it for the life of me. But she knew the name, and she knew I knew it too. It's a terrifying thing, isn't it, when the person who is supposed to be your safe harbor is the one watching the pirates board the ship? When the silence of a loved one is louder than any threat, a gaping void where protection ought to be. That was my mother's greatest weapon, her silence, her refusal to see, which she had now honed into a sharp, invisible blade. The house, my sanctuary, began to feel like enemy territory. Every object held a potential threat. One afternoon, I came downstairs to find her sitting in my armchair, an old photo album open on her lap. It was one I kept on the bottom shelf, full of pictures from before I even met Dennis. Pictures of my father, of me as a little girl with scraped knees and a gappy smile, and pictures of her and Larry. She had found it. She held up a black and white photograph of their wedding day. She, a pretty, hopeful widow, and he, a man in a crisp suit, his arm possessively around her waist, a pious smile on his face that didn't reach his cold, flat eyes. "Look, Betty," she said, her voice full of a syrupy nostalgia. "Look how handsome he was, so strong. He took such good care of us, didn't he? A real blessing from the Lord." She traced his outline with a gnarled finger. "He was so proud of you, you know. He just wanted you to be happy. You were such a serious little thing, always with your nose in a book. He used to say, "That girl thinks too much. She needs to learn to relax and enjoy life." Her words were a distortion of the truth so profound, it made me physically ill. His version of relaxing was a horror I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I snatched the album from her hands, my movements jerky and uncontrolled. "We don't look at these," I said, my voice dangerously low. Her face crumpled in on itself, a perfect imitation of hurt and confusion. "But they're our memories," she whimpered. "They're all I have left." I shoved the album back onto the shelf and walked out of the room, my own history now feeling contaminated, poisoned by her revisionist narrative. The constant, low-level stress began to take its toll. I stopped sleeping through the night, waking up at 2 or 3 in the morning, my heart pounding, convinced I had heard the third step creak. I barely ate, the food Dennis prepared for me turning to cardboard in my mouth. I lost weight, and dark, bruised-looking circles appeared under my eyes. I felt myself becoming that haunted, frightened girl again, and I hated it. I had fought so hard for so long to become this other person, this calm, capable, loved woman. Now, my mother was peeling that identity away, layer by painful layer, revealing the terrified child underneath. And Dennis noticed. Of course, he noticed. One evening, about a week after she arrived, he found me in the kitchen, staring into a cup of tea I had let go cold. Joan was in her room, the television murmuring softly. He came up behind me and gently kneaded my tense shoulders. "We need to talk," he said quietly. I tensed even further. "This isn't working, Betty. Having your mother here, it's destroying you. I see it. You're not sleeping, you're not eating. You walk around this house like a ghost. I thought it would be hard, but I didn't think it would be like this." "What is it? What really happened between you two all those years ago? It was more than just a falling out, wasn't it?" I stood there, my back to him, my eyes burning with unshed tears. This was it. This was my chance. The man I loved, the man I trusted above all others, was asking for the truth. All I had to do was turn around and let the poison I'd held inside for 6 long decades pour out of me. All I had to do was say the words. He hurt me. And she let him. But the words wouldn't come. They were trapped behind a wall of shame and fear built brick by brick when I was 12 years old. What if he didn't believe me? What if he thought I was exaggerating, a hysterical old woman dredging up a past best left buried? What if he looked at me and saw not a survivor, but someone damaged, tainted, broken? The lessons of my childhood were carved deep. Don't make trouble. Don't ruin things. No one will believe you. "I'm just not used to having someone else in the house," I said, my voice thin and weak. She was never a very warm person. We just bring out the worst in each other, I suppose. He sighed, a sound of deep frustration and disappointment. He knew I was lying, but he wouldn't push. He never pushed. "All right, Betty," he said, his hands dropping from my shoulders. "But if you change your mind, I'm here. I'm always here." He left the kitchen, and I felt his absence like a physical blow. In my effort to protect him, to protect myself, I was pushing away the only person who could help me. My mind, agitated and starved for sleep, began to wander down old, dark corridors. I started to remember things with a clarity that was terrifying. I remembered one particular Saturday afternoon. I was 13. Larry had decided the back fence needed painting, and he'd assigned me the job. My mother had gone into town for groceries. It was a hot, humid day, and he sat in a lawn chair in the shade, drinking iced tea and supervising. Every time I bent over to dip the brush in the paint can, I could feel his eyes on me. After about an hour, he called me over. "You've got a smudge of paint on your face," he said. I reached up to wipe it, but he grabbed my wrist. "No, let me." His other hand came up, and instead of wiping the paint, his thumb brushed slowly, deliberately across my lips. Then his hand slid down my neck and onto my shoulder, his fingers digging in painfully. "You're getting to be a real beauty, Betty girl," he whispered, his voice low and guttural. "A real temptation for a godly man." I panicked. I twisted away from him, stumbling backwards, and fell hard against the wheelbarrow full of gardening tools. The sharp edge of a trowel gashed my leg, deep and ugly. Blood welled up instantly, soaking my jeans. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the flash of fury on his face. He hated being defied. When my mother got home, she found me in the bathroom trying to clean the wound, which was still bleeding sluggishly. Larry was already spinning his story. "She's so clumsy, Joan," he said with a put-upon sigh. "Tripped over her own feet and fell. I told her to be more careful." My mother looked from the gash on my leg to my tear-streaked face. She saw the blood. She saw the terror in my eyes. She saw him standing there, his arms crossed, a look of righteous annoyance on his face. She had a choice, a clear, simple choice between her husband's story and her daughter's silent, bleeding plea. "Well, for heaven's sake, Betty, get it cleaned up," she said, her voice sharp with irritation. "And don't get any blood on the good towels. Honestly, the trouble you cause." She turned and walked away, leaving me alone with him standing in the doorway, a triumphant smirk on his face. She had seen the evidence, and she had chosen to be blind. That night, the gash throbbed with a fiery pain, but the wound in my soul, the one she had inflicted with her casual, cruel dismissal, hurt infinitely more. That memory, so vivid and raw, unlocked another. A small, decorative wooden box that Larry kept on his dresser. It was a simple, dark-stained box with a brass latch and a small keyhole. He kept it locked. I had asked my mother once what was inside, and she had snapped at me, telling me it was private and none of my business. But sometimes, late at night, I would see her, when she thought I was asleep, standing by that dresser, just looking at the box. She never opened it. She just stood there, her hand hovering over it, with a look of, what was it? Fear? Regret? I had forgotten about that box for 60 years. Now suddenly, it was all I could think about. What was in it? What secret did it hold that made my mother look so haunted? The breaking point came 2 nights later. Dennis had gone to bed early, exhausted from the tension in the house. I was reading in the living room when Joan came shuffling out of her room. She looked distressed, her hands twisting the fabric of her nightgown. "Betty," she began, her voice a pathetic quaver. "I had such a terrible dream. I dreamed you were angry with me, that you wanted me to leave. You looked at me with such hate in your eyes." She began to cry, soft, gulping sobs that sounded utterly convincing. "I don't understand why you dislike me so. I was always a good mother to you, wasn't I? I gave you everything I could." It was the most audacious lie yet, a performance so brazen it left me breathless. She was painting me as the villain, the cruel daughter tormenting her poor, ailing mother. And if Dennis had been there, he would have believed her. He would have rushed to her side, comforted her, and looked at me with disappointment. Something inside me snapped. The decades of silence, the carefully constructed walls of composure, they all came crashing down. I stood up, the book falling to the floor, and walked over to her until I was standing inches from her face. I was no longer a 73-year-old woman. I was a pillar of pure, cold rage. I waited until her fake sobs subsided. I looked directly into her watery, calculating eyes. "Stop it," I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet carrying more force than any shout. "Stop the act. I know you remember. I know you remember everything." She looked up at me, the tears drying on her cheeks as if by magic. The mask of the helpless victim fell away, revealing the hard, cold woman underneath. A slow, chilling smile spread across her lips. "Remember what, dear?" she asked, her voice dripping with venom. "That you were a hysterical, ungrateful child then, and you're a hysterical, unforgiving old woman now? You go ahead. You tell your sainted husband your little stories. Who do you think he's going to believe?" My mother's challenge hung in the air between us, sharp and glittering as a spider's web. Who do you think he's going to believe? It was the distilled essence of her power over me, the question that had kept me silent for all those decades. She had always known it was my word against the carefully constructed reality she presented to the world. For a long, silent moment, I saw the chessboard she saw. On one side, a frail, pitiable, God-fearing old woman. On the other, a daughter known for her moodiness, her quiet anxieties, a woman now seemingly overcome with resentment and stress. In her mind, the match was already won. I saw the flicker of triumph in her eyes, and in that instant, something profound shifted within me. The fear, the icy, paralyzing fear that had been my constant companion since childhood, didn't vanish. But it was suddenly joined by something else, something hot and hard and unyielding. Rage. A pure, cleansing rage. She wasn't just a woman who had failed to protect me. She was an active participant. Her silence hadn't been a weakness. It had been a weapon, and she was trying to use it on me one last time. I didn't say another word. I simply turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with her venomous smile fading into uncertainty. Her power lay in the engagement, in the argument, in my fear. I would give her none of it. I went upstairs to the bedroom I shared with Dennis. He was already asleep, his steady, rhythmic breathing a sound that had meant safety to me for over 5 decades. Tonight, it sounded like a reproach. How could I have allowed my fear of the past to endanger the honesty of our present? I didn't sleep. I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the moon travel across the sky, and I let myself think. Have you ever felt a truth so heavy inside you that you fear it will break you if you let it out, but you know it will turn to poison if you keep it in? That was where I stood, on the knife's edge between 2 impossible choices. For many years, I had chosen silence to protect myself, to protect the life I built, to protect Dennis from the ugliness I came from. But my mother's arrival had proven that the past was not a buried thing. It was a living, breathing monster, and by keeping it locked inside me, I had allowed it to fester and grow. Joan's threat wasn't about who Dennis would believe. It was a dare. She was daring me to remain in the prison of my own making. And that night, I decided I was done serving the sentence for a crime I didn't commit. A new resolve settled over me as the first gray light of dawn touched the sky. I would tell Dennis. I would tell him everything. Not to win a battle against my mother, but to finally be free. And before I told him, I needed to find the one thing, the only tangible piece of that hell that I could hold in my hands. The locked wooden box. My mother was a creature of habit. Every morning at 9, after Dennis had helped her with her breakfast and given her the morning paper, she would use the bathroom for a good 20 minutes. It was my only window of opportunity. That morning, my heart beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I watched the clock. The moment I heard the bathroom door click shut, I moved. I slipped into her room, my slippered feet silent on the hardwood floor. The room smelled of her, that cloying mix of lavender and decay. Her few possessions were neat, almost unnervingly so. A stack of romance novels on the bedside table, her worn-out Bible, a framed picture of her and my father. Larry was conspicuously absent. It was all part of the performance. Her clothes were folded in the dresser, her shoes lined up in the closet. I felt a surge of revulsion, an intruder in the enemy's camp. I started with the dresser, my hands shaking as I sifted through her slips and sweaters. Nothing. I checked under the bed, in the closet. Nothing. My last hope was the single battered suitcase tucked away on the top shelf of the closet. It looked ancient, the same one she'd had for as long as I could remember. I pulled it down, my arms trembling from the strain. It was heavier than it looked. I laid it on the bed and fumbled with the rusty latches. They sprang open with a groan. Inside were layers of yellowed linens, baby clothes that must have been mine, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a threadbare towel, was the box. My breath caught. It was smaller than I remembered, the dark wood unscratched by time. The small brass latch was still in place. It was locked. I ran my fingers over it, the cold metal a shock against my skin. It was real. I hadn't imagined it. I tucked it under my arm, my mind racing. Where was the key? I gave the room one last, desperate scan. Nothing. The sound of the toilet flushing from the bathroom sent a jolt of panic through me. I had to get out. I closed the suitcase, shoved it back onto the shelf, and slipped out of the room just as the bathroom door began to open. I spent the rest of the day in a fugue state, the locked box hidden in my knitting basket, a hard, secret weight in the center of my life. I was waiting for the right moment, though I didn't know what that moment would look like. I just knew I couldn't carry it alone any longer. The moment came after dinner. Dennis, sensing the unbearable tension, had suggested we all watch a movie together. We sat in the living room, the flickering light of the television playing on our faces, a grotesque parody of a happy family. Joan was dozing in her armchair. Dennis was next to me on the sofa, but the distance between us felt like miles. He kept glancing at me, his face etched with a pain and confusion that I had put there. I couldn't do it anymore. I stood up and turned off the television. The sudden silence jolted Joan awake. Dennis looked at me, startled. "Betty? What is it?" I walked over to my knitting basket and took out the box. I returned to the coffee table and placed it in the center of the room, between the three of us. The sound of the wood against the glass was sharp, definitive. "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice shaking but clear. "Something I should have told you 55 years ago." Dennis stared at the box, then at my face. Joan's eyes were wide, all trace of sleepiness gone. A flicker of genuine fear, the first I had ever seen, crossed her face. "Betty, maybe this isn't the time," Dennis began, but I held up a hand. "It is the time," I said. "It's 60 years past time." And so I told him. I started at the beginning, with my father's death and my mother's desperation. I told him about Larry's arrival, the perfect Christian gentleman. Then, my voice dropping, I told him about the looks, the touches, the late-night visits. I told him about the creaking third stair and how that sound had become the soundtrack to my terror. I told him about the first time I tried to tell my mother and how she had called me a liar and an ungrateful child. I told him about the gash on my leg and how she had worried more about blood on her good towels than the fear in her daughter's eyes. As I spoke, the shame that had silenced me for so long began to burn away, replaced by the simple, stark truth. I looked at Dennis, my beloved Dennis, and I saw the confusion on his face melt into dawning horror. His eyes flickered towards Joan, then back to me, and I could see the pieces clicking into place. My fear of sleeping by the door, my panic attacks, my lifelong sadness, it all suddenly had a name. And that name was Larry. Joan, for her part, had begun to cry. "She's making it all up, Dennis," she wailed, her voice thick with practiced despair. "She's always had a cruel streak. She's twisting things. She's confused. Her mind. It's not right." But Dennis wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "Is that it, Betty?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Is that the whole story?" "No," I said softly. "The worst part was that she knew. She didn't just ignore it. She knew what he was, and she chose him anyway." "That's a lie!" Joan shrieked, half rising from her chair. A vicious, hateful lie. Is it? I said, my voice cold as ice. I pointed to the box. This was his. He kept it on his dresser, locked. What's inside it, Mother? What's in the box that you were so afraid of? Joan stared at the box as if it were a venomous snake. She shook her head, muttering, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know anything about a box. But Dennis had seen enough. The final piece of the puzzle, the final validation of my story, was his to give. He looked at my mother, and the warmth and compassion that had defined him his entire life were gone, replaced by a cold, hard fury that I had never seen before. Where is the key, Joan? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I don't have a key. It's her fantasy. Dennis stood up and walked over to her. He was not a threatening man, but in that moment, his righteous anger made him terrifying. My wife has lived in this hell for the better part of her life because of you, he said, his voice trembling with rage. The lies are over. Give me the key. Joan shrank back in her chair, a cornered animal. Her hand flew instinctively to her neck, to a thin silver chain she always wore tucked beneath her collar. Dennis's eyes followed the movement. Slowly, he reached out, and she flinched as he pulled the chain from under her blouse. Dangling from it was a single, small, ornate brass key. He didn't say a word. He took the key from the chain, walked back to the coffee table, knelt, and inserted it into the lock on the box. It turned with a small metallic click that sounded as loud as a thunderclap in the silent room. He lifted the lid. For a moment he just stared, his face unreadable. Joan was sobbing hysterically now, a raw, ugly sound of defeat. I held my breath. What is it? I whispered. He looked up at me, and his eyes were full of a terrible, terrible pain. He reached into the box and pulled out a small, faded blue satin hair ribbon. Then, a child's silver locket, tarnished with age. Then, a small white button, the kind from a little girl's Sunday dress. And underneath them all, a stack of letters, tied with twine. He untied them and unfolded the top one. He read for a moment, his expression hardening into stone. Oh God, Betty, he breathed, his voice breaking. He held the letter out to me. It wasn't from Larry. It was from a woman. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. It read, Mr. Miller, I am begging you. For the love of God, stay away from my daughter. She is only 14. She says you have been giving her gifts, telling her things. My husband will not believe me. He says you are a man of God. But I see the way you look at her. Please, I am begging you, leave our little girl alone. There were 4 other letters, all from different women, all telling the same terrifying story. And tucked in with them were the trinkets. The trophies. Larry wasn't just my monster. He was a predator, a collector, and the box was his collection. I looked from the horrifying contents of the box to my mother. She had stopped crying and was staring into the distance, her face a blank, empty mask. She hadn't just suspected. She hadn't just been willfully blind. She had known. She had known he hunted children, and she had kept his trophies for him. She had locked away the proof of his evil and worn the key around her neck for 60 years, a silent, damning testament to the depth of her betrayal. The silence that fell upon the room after the contents of the box were revealed was a thing of immense weight, a physical pressure that seemed to suck all the air from my lungs. The small, pathetic trinkets lay on the dark wood of the coffee table like unearthed bones, a miniature graveyard of stolen girlhoods. The letters with their desperate, spidery script were testaments to a horror I had thought was mine alone. My monster had not been mine alone. He had been a plague, and my mother had knowingly sheltered him. Dennis was the first to move. He slowly, deliberately began placing the items back into the box. His hands, usually so steady, trembled with a rage so profound it seemed to make the very air around him vibrate. He didn't look at my mother. He didn't look at me. He looked at the evidence of a lifetime of depravity. When everything was back inside, he closed the lid and pushed the box to the center of the table. Then he looked at Joan. The woman who sat huddled in the armchair was a stranger. The cunning manipulator, the master of feigned confusion, the cruel challenger, all of them were gone. All that was left was a hollowed-out old woman, her face gray and slack with the terror of final, absolute exposure. She was staring at the box, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Why? Dennis's voice was a low growl, devoid of any of the warmth or kindness I had ever heard in it. It was the voice of a judge speaking to a condemned criminal. Why did you keep it? Why did you stay? Joan shook her head, a slow, numb motion. He told me to, she whispered, her voice barely audible. After the first time, a woman from the church came to the house crying. Her husband wasn't home. She told me Larry had been talking to her daughter. I didn't believe her. I told her she was mistaken, that he was a man of God. I sent her away. Her eyes were fixed on the past now, her voice taking on a distant, narrative quality as she unspooled the 60-year-old secret. But then, a week later, I was cleaning his dresser, and I found the key. I opened the box. There was just one ribbon in it then, a red one, and a letter, the letter from that woman. I confronted him. I was going to leave. Her voice broke. I packed your little suitcase, Betty. I was going to take you and run. I stared at her, my heart a cold, dead weight in my chest. There was a version of my life, a better life, that had almost happened. A life where she had chosen me. What happened? Dennis pressed, his voice merciless. He came home and found me, she said, her voice flat. He didn't yell. He was never a yeller. He was calm. He explained to me, very patiently, that the woman was a liar, that her daughter was troubled. He said the box was just a reminder, to pray for the wicked people in the world. And then he told me what would happen if I left. He said no one would believe me. He said he was a respected deacon and I was just a poor, hysterical widow. He said he would tell everyone I was an unfit mother, that he would have you taken away from me and put in a home. And I believed him. I was so scared of being alone again, of being poor, scared of losing you. So you sacrificed me instead, I said, the words falling from my lips with no heat, only a vast, empty sadness. I was weak, she cried, the first spark of emotion returning. I was a coward. After that, he would show me the new ones, the ribbons, the buttons. He'd put them in the box. It was his way of reminding me that I was trapped, that I was his accomplice. He said as long as I kept the box, I was as guilty as he was, and I could never betray him. She finally looked at me, her eyes swimming in tears of self-pity. I stayed to protect you, don't you see? If I left, he would have found you. The lie was so audacious, so pathetically self-serving, that it couldn't even touch me. The rage was gone, the pain was gone. All I felt was a profound and bottomless pity for this woman who had twisted her own cowardice into a sick parody of maternal love. You didn't stay to protect me, I said, my voice calm and final. You stayed to protect yourself. And every day you stayed, every time he walked up those stairs, every time you heard that third step creak and you pulled the covers over your head, you were helping him hurt me. You were holding the door for him. Dennis stood up. I'm going to make a phone call, he said, his voice flat. He walked out of the room, and I heard him in the kitchen, his voice a low, firm murmur. He was calling social services. I was alone with her. She looked at me, her face a mess of tears and desperation. Betty, please, she begged, don't let him send me away. I'm your mother. Where will I go? I looked at this woman, this stranger who shared my blood but not my heart, and I felt the chains I had worn for 6 decades fall away from me. She had no more power. Her threats were empty. Her tears were meaningless. She was just a sad, frightened old woman who had made a series of terrible choices and was now, finally, facing the consequences. "You will go where they send you, Joan," I said, "and you will be alone, just as I was when I was a child in your house." When Dennis came back, he didn't speak to her. He spoke to me. "They'll be here in the morning," he said softly. "They'll find another placement for her." He came and stood behind me, his hands resting on my shoulders, a silent, unshakable wall of support. We were a team. A real team. The departure the next morning was a quiet, gray affair. The social worker who arrived was older, her eyes full of a weary understanding that told me Dennis had explained some of the situation. There were no recriminations, no dramatic scenes. Joan was already packed, her single battered suitcase by the door. She didn't look at me as she was helped into her coat. She didn't say goodbye. As she was led out of the house, she was just a small, stooped figure, a ghost being exorcised from the home she had haunted. I watched the county car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street, and I felt nothing. Not joy, not anger, not even relief. Just a vast, quiet emptiness where a wound I had carried for a lifetime used to be. When the car was gone, Dennis closed the door. He turned to me, his dear face full of a love so profound, it brought tears to my eyes. He held me, and for the first time in my 73 years, I felt completely and utterly safe. The days that followed were like waking from a long and terrible fever. The world seemed brighter, the air cleaner. Dennis and I talked for hours, for days. I filled in the gaps of his knowledge, and he listened, his anger on my behalf a healing balm. Our love, which I had always thought was strong, was forged into something new, something unbreakable, tempered in the fire of this terrible, shared truth. About a week later, Dennis and I took the box to the local police station. We sat with a kind, solemn detective, a woman about my own granddaughter's age, and I told my story one more time. I knew Larry was beyond the reach of the law, but the other girls, the owners of the ribbons and lockets, deserved to have their truth recorded. The detective handled the items with a reverent care. She told me that while there was little they could do now, the file would remain open. The box and its contents were entered into evidence. Larry's secrets were no longer mine to keep. They belonged to the world now, a formal record of his evil. The following Saturday, I called the carpenter who had always worked on our house. "I have a small job for you," I told him. When he arrived, I led him to the staircase. "The third step," I said. "It creaks. I want you to fix it. I want you to make it silent." He gave me a puzzled look, remembering my strange requests from years past, but he simply nodded and went to work. I stood and listened to the sounds of his tools. An hour later, he was done. He beckoned me over. "Go on, ma'am," he said. "Try it now." I placed my foot on the third step, then my full weight. There was nothing, only the solid, reassuring quiet of a well-made stair. I walked up and down the staircase 3 times, each step a silent testament to my freedom. The sound of my childhood terror was gone. I had silenced it for good. That night, as I got into bed, I looked at the door to our bedroom. For 55 years, I had insisted on leaving it ajar, a subconscious escape route I always needed to feel safe. Tonight I got up, walked to the door, and pushed it closed until I heard the soft click of the latch. Then I went back to bed, into the arms of my husband, and I slept a deep, dreamless sleep for the first time since I was 12 years old. The monster was gone. The ghosts were banished. I was finally free. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please share it, because who knows, maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.